Good day, everyone. I am Mary Francine Ibida, taking up Bachelor of Secondary Education major in English, 4th year level. So for today's report, I will be discussing culturally responsive teaching, which focuses on how teachers can build meaningful and respectful interactions with learners from diverse cultural and linguistic backgrounds. But before we begin, let me first present the objectives of our discussion. At the end of the lesson, students will be able to analyze the core principles and 8 competencies of culturally responsive teaching and their relevance to effective teacher-learner interaction. Construct appropriate teacher-learner responses that reflect the core principles and competencies of culturally responsive teaching across various classroom situations. Reflect on their own cultural beliefs, values, and assumptions in relation to how this may influence their interactions with learners from diverse cultural and linguistic backgrounds. So these objectives will serve as our guide throughout the discussion. Now, let us start with the first slide. What is culturally responsive teaching? Culturally responsive teaching recognizes the cultural knowledge, experiences, and perspectives and communication styles that learners bring into the classroom. So instead of assuming that everyone has the same background or learns in the same way, teachers consider these differences when planning lessons. This makes learning more meaningful and connected to students' lives. This approach is strongly associated with Geneva Gay, particularly in her 2000 work on culturally responsive teaching. It reminds us that effective teaching is not only about delivering content, but also about understanding the learners receiving it. Now that we understand its meaning, let us look at its core principles. So there are 5 core principles of culturally responsive teaching. First, cultural knowledge and awareness means understanding learners' cultures while being aware of our own. Second, culturally relevant curriculum and instruction means connecting lessons to learners' experiences and communities. Third, high expectations for all learners means believing every learner can succeed while providing needed support. Fourth, caring and supportive relationships focus on trust, respect, and empathy. And lastly, culturally responsive communication means respecting learners' different languages and communication styles. Together, these principles help create meaningful and inclusive learning experiences. Now let us look at the 8 competencies that show how teachers can apply these principles. The first competency is reflect on one's cultural lens. Now, teachers have their own beliefs, values, experiences, and cultural backgrounds which can affect how they interpret learners' behavior. For example, a teacher may see a quiet student as uninterested when the student may simply have a different communication style. Teachers must therefore recognize their assumptions and consider how this may influence their interactions with learners. This is important because culturally responsive teaching begins with self-awareness. So once teachers understand their own perspectives, they can also recognize biases that may affect learners. So the second competency is recognize and redress bias in the system. So bias can influence how teachers view learners, what they expect from them, and what opportunities they provide. So for example, assuming a learner is less capable because of their cultural or socio-economic background that can lead to lower expectations. Culturally responsive teachers challenge these assumptions and examine whether their practices are fair and equitable. The goal is to give all learners meaningful opportunities to participate, learn, and succeed. So after recognizing bias, teachers can also use learners' cultures as strength in the classroom. The third competency is draw on students' culture to shape curriculum and instruction. Learners bring knowledge and experiences from their families and communities. Teachers can connect these experiences to academic lessons. For example, the teachers can use situations or examples from students' communities when explaining a topic. This makes learning more relevant and helps students connect school lessons to everyday life. However, students should avoid stereotyping because learners from the same cultural group may have different experiences. Teachers can also make learning meaningful by connecting it to real world issues. Now, the fourth competency is bring real world issues into the classroom. So, this means connecting academic lessons to situations learners actually encounter. For example, instead of discussing environmental problems only through a textbook, teachers can relate the lesson to environmental concerns in the students' community. This helps learners apply academic knowledge while developing critical thinking and problem solving skills. It also shows them that what they learn in school is useful beyond the classroom. However, making learning relevant must also come with the belief that every learner can succeed. The fifth competency is model high expectations for all students. Culturally responsive teachers believe that every learner is capable of learning and succeeding. High expectations do not mean ignoring individual needs. Teachers should maintain realistic challenges while providing the necessary support. For example, instead of lowering expectations for a struggling learner, a teacher can provide additional assistance while still showing confidence in their ability to improve. This can strengthen learners' confidence, persistence, and motivation. Along with high expectations, teachers must also respect and value student differences. Now, the next competency is promote respect for student differences. Learners have different cultures, languages, experiences, and perspectives. These differences should be respected rather than treated as weaknesses. For example, when a learner expresses an idea differently, the teacher should listen and try to understand instead of immediately judging them. When learners feel respected and valued, they are more likely to participate and feel that they belong in the classroom. Respecting learners also means recognizing the role of their families and communities. Now, the next competency is collaborate with families and the local community. Now, teachers are not the only ones who support learners. Families and communities also provide valuable knowledge, experiences, and resources. Teachers can communicate with families, involve them with learning activities, and connect classroom lessons with community knowledge. This strengthens the relationship between school, home, and community and helps teachers better understand their learners. Finally, all these relationships depend greatly on effective communication. This brings us to our final competency. Now, the eighth competency is communicate in linguistically and culturally responsive ways. Learners may have different languages, accents, communication styles, and ways of expressing themselves. Teachers should recognize these differences and communicate in ways that are clear, respectful, and inclusive. This can mean listening carefully, giving learners enough time to express themselves, using understandable language, and allowing them to share their experiences. Now, culturally responsive communication is not only about how teachers speak, but also about how they listen and respond. When learners feel that their voices are respected, the relationships become stronger and classroom participation improves. Now, to sum up, culturally responsive teaching is about recognizing and valuing learners' cultural knowledge, experiences, perspectives, and ways of communicating, and using this to make teaching more meaningful and effective. Now, that wraps up our discussion on culturally responsive teaching. Thank you for your time, and I hope you learned something valuable from our discussion.